Welcome to Detective Street. In tonight's episode, we travel back to Victorian London, where the fog curls through Baker Street, and a single knock at the door can unravel the calm of an ordinary morning. Behind that familiar door, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are about to confront a mystery that begins with the faintest of clues and ends in a revelation that could shake even the great detective himself. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoy these mysteries, please consider subscribing to the channel. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Reading your words always brings me joy and keeps me inspired to share more tales. Now, pour yourself a cup of tea, settle into your favorite chair, and let us begin. The Adventure of the Glass Artery. Chapter 1. Shards in the fog. The raw November fog that morning hung over London like a burial shroud, muffling the clip-clop of horses and the rattle of wheels until all the great metropolis seemed wrapped in cotton wool. It was through this grey veil that I made my way toward Baker Street, summoned by a note from my old friend which contained but a single cryptic sentence. "Come at once, Watson. The matter is both urgent and singular." I found Sherlock Holmes in his familiar morning attire, the mouse-coloured dressing gown draped about his lean frame, Turkish slippers upon his feet. But there was nothing familiar about his posture. He sat cross-legged in his armchair, like some Eastern mystic, the Persian slipper of tobacco swinging neglected from the mantelpiece, while the chemical table blazed with spirit lamps that cast dancing shadows across the walls of our sitting room. Upon the table at his elbow lay a curious litter of glass tubes, each no thicker than a knitting needle, and gleaming like captured moonbeams in the lamplight. His long, nervous fingers were pressed together in an attitude of intense concentration, and he didn't look up as my shadow fell across the hearthrug. Through the powerful lens of his pocket microscope, he was examining one of the delicate tubes with the absorption of a naturalist studying some exotic specimen. "Ha!" he cried suddenly, his grey eyes flashing with that peculiar light which always kindled when he struck upon a significant detail. "Observe, Watson. Hemoglobin along the inner wall, coagulated in an irregular pattern. Precisely what one would expect to find in a vessel that has been subjected to intense heat and sudden constriction." I laid aside my hat and gloves, noting how the fog had followed me in, wreathing about the doorway like some living thing reluctant to release its hold. "You have acquired some new apparatus, Holmes," said I, gesturing toward the delicate contrivances. "What manner of instrument is this?" "An instrument of murder," he replied, with that maddeningly placid tone he affected when delivering his most shocking pronouncements. He pushed toward me a shallow dish containing 3 of the mysterious tubes. Each was stained along its inner curve with a thread of rust-coloured substance, and while one end of each had been cleanly sealed by flame, the other was shattered into a fringe of wicked little spicules that caught the light like tiny daggers. "Surely you jest, Holmes?" "By no means, my dear fellow." He indicated the fragile objects with the amber stem of his pipe, which he had taken from the rack with the deliberate care of a man choosing his words. "These crystalline fragments formed, until last evening, an integral part of the circulatory system of one Dr. Erasmus Finch, Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons and formerly of Harley Street. I say formerly in both the professional and corporeal sense, for his practice has ended with his life." The fire crackled in the grate, sending sparks up the chimney, while outside the fog pressed against our windows like curious fingers. How came they into your possession? By special messenger from Scotland Yard. Inspector Lestrade, who is, whatever his limitations, an honest and methodical plodder, derived from these objects only the obvious conclusion that the unfortunate Dr. Finch had been experimenting with unusual apparatus at the time of his demise. He has retained the body for the coroner's examination and forwarded to me these seemingly insignificant remnants. Between his methodical approach and my own methods, Watson, we may yet reconstruct a complete picture from these scattered fragments. But first, pray tell me what you observe. I took up one of the tubes with the utmost caution, for even in their broken state they possessed an almost serpentine malevolence. The blood within had dried to a dark filament along one side, no thicker than a human hair. The fused end was smooth as a pearl, while the shattered terminus bristled with points sharp enough to pierce flesh. When I held it to my nose, I detected a faint but distinct odor, something chemical and acrid beneath the metallic scent of dried blood. A capillary tube of glass, I ventured, heated at one end to form a seal, then deliberately broken at the other. The blood trace is remarkably uniform, too precise to have resulted from random spillage. Excellent, Watson. Your medical training serves you well. Holmes's face brightened with approval. Now observe the faint clouding at the sealed end. Minute bubbling, such as occurs when volatile fluids are expelled by rapid heating. This tells us that our Dr. Finch was not merely experimenting. He was actively pumping fluids through these vessels. His own blood? That remains to be determined, though I suspect not. Holmes rose from his chair with the fluid motion of a man who had made up his mind to action. The deceased had recently devoted his considerable talents to the invention of artificial blood vessels. Glass arteries, he termed them, with a flourish that his more conservative colleagues found particularly offensive. One of those same colleagues discovered him shortly after midnight upon the floor of his surgery, his right wrist opened by what appeared to be a self-inflicted wound. These diabolical fragments scattered about the room, and, most significantly, the window unlatched from within. As Holmes spoke, he was transforming himself from contemplative scholar to man of purpose, casting aside his dressing gown and donning his familiar jacket with swift, economical movements. The fog swirled outside our window, and somewhere in its depths I could hear the mournful cry of a street vendor calling his wares. "Suicide by surgical misadventure," pronounces Inspector Lestrade, with his customary confidence in the obvious. Holmes continued, adjusting his collar with a sharp tug. "A brilliant surgeon, driven to despair by the failure of his revolutionary invention, takes his own life in a moment of scientific desperation. It has all the hallmarks of a tragedy that the press so dearly loves." "But you suspect otherwise." Holmes's smile was thin as winter sunlight. "I suspect, my dear Watson, that we are dealing with something far more sinister than suicide. The scene bears all the theatrical hallmarks of deliberate staging. Your hat and stick. We have a morning appointment, which my earlier dispatch anticipated. If you have finished admiring these instruments of destruction, we shall go and pay our respects to the grieving widow. Mrs. Finch has agreed to see us. She has little choice in the matter. In my experience, Watson, grief, when it is honest, often proves the most effective solvent of deception. The bereaved see clearly through the fog that obscures the vision of others. He paused at the door, his hawk-like profile silhouetted against the grey light filtering through the hallway window. "Come, let us see what truth the widow's tears may wash clean." 5 minutes later, we were seated in a hansom cab, the fog streaming past in tattered ribbons as our horse picked its way through the morning traffic. Holmes sat forward, his head thrust out into the murky air like a hunting hound catching scent, his keen eyes darting from shadow to shadow, as if reading some invisible script written in the very texture of the mist. "Glass arteries," he murmured, more to himself than to me. A phrase calculated to make a coroner shudder and a murderer smile. "Tell me, Watson, in your medical opinion, what manner of man would conceive such devices?" I considered the question as our wheels splashed through a puddle left by yesterday's rain. "A visionary, certainly, the sort who sees beyond conventional limitations, but also, I fear, the sort who might overlook the dangers inherent in pushing the boundaries of what is possible." "Just so." Holmes nodded approvingly. "A man of genius, but perhaps lacking in the practical wisdom that tempers brilliance with caution. Such men often attract both disciples and enemies, and it is not always easy to distinguish between the two until it is far too late." Chapter 2. The Widow's Tale. The Finch establishment in Wimpole Street presented that aspect of quiet respectability which marks the residence of a successful medical practitioner. The brass nameplate gleamed despite the morning's gloom, the steps had been recently scrubbed, and that distinctive odour of carbolic and starch which clings to a surgeon's premises hung faintly in the fog-thickened air. We were admitted by a housemaid whose red-rimmed eyes spoke eloquently of recent grief and conducted through a hall lined with anatomical prints to a modest morning room overlooking a small garden. Mrs. Finch awaited us there, and I confess that her appearance surprised me. She was of that dark, slender type which often looks younger than its years, with an olive complexion that suggested Mediterranean ancestry and remarkable composure for one so recently widowed. There was intelligence in the set of her features, a gravity about the eyelids, and a firmness about the mouth that spoke of either uncommon fortitude or early schooling in the necessity of restraint. She rose at our entrance with natural grace, though I noted how her fingers trembled slightly as she gestured toward chairs arranged near the window. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice carrying only the faintest tremor, "I am grateful you have come. The police have been thorough, but they ask only about facts. You, I am told, seek truth." Holmes settled into his chair with that peculiar stillness which came over him when interviewing witnesses, like a spider waiting at the center of its web for the first vibration that would tell him which way to strike. "You have my deepest sympathy, madam," he said, with a gentleness I had learned to recognize as the mark of his highest respect. "I shall not abuse your patience with unnecessary questions. There are certain aspects of your husband's death which the official investigation may overlook. If you will speak frankly with me, I believe I may be able to bring you the comfort of certainty, whatever form that certainty may take." Mrs. Finch's hands, which had been clasped in her lap, relaxed slightly. "I will tell you everything I know, Mr. Holmes. Erasmus was a man of extraordinary ability, too extraordinary, perhaps, for his own good. It was his misfortune to be, as he often said, 10 years ahead of his time. These past months he had devoted himself entirely to perfecting an invention of his own design, those terrible glass tubes you doubtless saw. He claimed they could carry blood where diseased vessels had failed, that they might revolutionize the treatment of circulatory ailments. She paused, gazing out at the garden where the fog hung among the bare branches like ghostly fruit. I begged him to rest, to take time away from his work. He would laugh and say he was upon the very artery of immortality. Those were his exact words. He believed he stood at the threshold of a discovery that would make him famous throughout the medical world. But others did not share his enthusiasm, Holmes prompted gently. Bitterly opposed would be a more accurate description. Her voice hardened slightly. There were letters, anonymous at first, calling him charlatan, vivisectionist, worse than murderer. Then came personal callers. One in particular I saw with my own eyes, and the memory of him still makes me shudder. Holmes leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Describe this gentleman. Tall, nearly as tall as yourself, mister. Holmes, with the bearing of a military man, despite his civilian dress. He wore a long coat of foreign cut and carried himself with that peculiar stiffness which suggests old wounds imperfectly healed. His face was marked by a white scar that ran from his left temple across the brow, giving him a permanently sneering expression. But what struck me most forcibly were his hands. He wore black leather gloves, even in the warmest weather, great thick things that seemed to dwarf his fingers. How often did this individual call upon your husband? 4 times that I know of, though there may have been others. The last visit was 3 nights ago. They met in Erasmus's surgery, and I could hear their voices raised in heated discussion. Most unusual, for my husband was typically the gentlest of men. When I ventured to knock upon the door, I found the room empty and the garden door standing open. Erasmus was very pale and refused to explain what had transpired. He would say only that the man had demanded something he could not in good conscience provide. Holmes's fingers drummed silently against his knee. Did you advise him to contact the authorities? I pleaded with him to go to the police. Mrs. Finch's composure cracked slightly, and I saw tears glittering in her dark eyes. He replied that the law knows nothing of arteries, and that to involve them would ruin his reputation with his medical colleagues before he had opportunity to prove the value of his work. He was convinced that professional jealousy lay behind the threats against him. And on the night of his death, she drew a shuddering breath. I retired at my usual hour, shortly before 11 o'clock. Erasmus remained in his surgery, saying he wished to complete some correspondence. I am a light sleeper, mister. Holmes and I woke sometime after midnight to a strange sound, like the gentle tapping of a spoon against crystal. It lasted only a moment, then ceased. I must have dozed again, for the next thing I knew it was morning, and the maid was screaming. The maid discovered the body? At 7:30, she had gone to lay the fire in the surgery, and found— Mrs. Finch pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Erasmus lay upon the tiles, his arm extended toward the window. The glass tubes were scattered about him like broken icicles, and there was so much blood. Holmes waited while she composed herself, his grey eyes never leaving her face. When she was able to continue, he asked quietly, "What, if anything, was missing from the surgery?" Her brows drew together in concentration. Missing. In a chamber devoted to scientific work, Mrs. Finch, an absence often speaks as loudly as a presence. Was any apparatus removed? Any documents taken? She considered this carefully. There were 2 small pumping devices which Erasmus had constructed to work in conjunction with the glass tubes. Ingenious little mechanisms, no larger than a lady's powder compact. I did not see them afterward. And his experimental journal, a leather-bound ledger in which he recorded all his trials and observations, was nowhere to be found. I assumed he had put it away for safekeeping. Or someone else had done so for him, Holmes murmured. One final question, if you please. Besides the gentleman with the scarred face, did your husband have any other patrons interested in his work? Mrs. Finch hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. There was a letter, which arrived perhaps a month ago. Erasmus burned it in the fireplace, but not before I glimpsed the seal, a foreign crest bearing the image of an eagle with spread wings. He seemed both excited and troubled by its contents, and when I asked about it, he said only that it concerned a demonstration planned for the spring. I begged him to refuse whatever was being proposed, but he kissed my forehead and said that the future could not be kept waiting for the timid. Holmes rose to his feet with the fluid grace of a cat. You have been of immense service, Mrs. Finch. If I find it necessary to intrude upon your grief again, I trust it will be with better news than questions. Meanwhile, I strongly recommend that you keep your doors securely bolted and admit no visitors unless their credentials can be thoroughly verified. A man who has killed once for a journal may well return for what else he believes you may possess. In the street, the fog had lifted slightly, though the sky remained the color of tarnished pewter. Holmes fell into one of those profound silences which I had learned to respect, walking with his hands clasped behind his back and his sharp profile turned toward some inner vision. It lasted until we reached the corner chemist's shop, where he darted in with sudden purpose and emerged carrying a small brown bottle, which he tucked into his waistcoat pocket. For later analysis, he explained cryptically. Now, Watson, we must make our way to Fleet Lane. When a man requires capillary glass of exceptional fineness, there are but 2 establishments in all London where such delicate work is undertaken with any degree of skill. We shall begin with the less reputable of the 2. In my experience, the makers of questionable instruments are often more forthcoming about their clientele than those who confine themselves to legitimate purposes. Chapter 3. The Glassblower's Tale. Fleet Lane wore its industrial grime like a badge of honor, and the Meridian Glass Works fitted its surroundings perfectly. A sooty wedge of brick squeezed between a cooperage that reeked of hops and oak shavings, and a rag merchant's establishment, whose windows displayed the accumulated debris of 100,000 discarded lives. The fog had settled here more thickly than elsewhere, perhaps drawn by the heat of the furnaces, and the very air seemed to taste of coal smoke and molten sand. Within the factory, the atmosphere was thick enough to cut, heavy with the odors of soda ash and fire. Men moved like phantoms among the glowing furnaces, their leather aprons blackened by years of labor, drawing molten glass into threads that cooled and hardened with musical chimes upon the cooling racks. The heat was intense, and I could feel perspiration gathering beneath my collar despite the November chill outside. We were conducted to the office of the foreman, a thick-set man whose large, fleshy ears bore the striped scars that marked him as a veteran of the trade. His hands, I noted, were crossed with a network of fine cuts from handling sharp glass, and his eyes held the peculiar squint that comes from years of peering into the white-hot hearts of furnaces. Holmes placed one of the broken capillary tubes upon the man's cluttered desk with the reverence of a priest handling a sacred relic. "Have you produced work of this gauge?" The foreman lifted the fragment, grunting with the effort of bending his considerable bulk, and held it up to catch the dusty light streaming through the grimy windows. His thick fingers turned it this way and that, and I saw his expression grow thoughtful. "Aye, we did a run of this exact specification not more than a month past," he said finally. "Tricky work, that. Required Parian sand of the finest grade and a touch of glycerin in the drawing solution to achieve the proper flexibility. Special order it was, and we turned out precisely half a gross to the customer's requirements." Holmes's eyes glittered with interest. "And who, might I ask, placed this particular order?" The foreman scratched his grizzled jaw, leaving a streak of soot across his weathered skin. "Foreign gentleman. Tall fellow with military bearing. You could tell by the way he held his shoulders. Had a scar across his brow that gave him a perpetual scowl, and wore gloves the like of which I'd never seen. Articulated things made of leather and steel, more like a surgeon's instruments than proper handwear. Did he provide a name? Called himself Reed, though whether that was Christian name or surname I couldn't say. Spoke excellent English, but with an accent that put me in mind of the Prussian officers I encountered during my own military service. Paid in gold sovereigns, fresh from the mint, and took delivery of the entire order in a hired cart." "Did he speak of his intended use for these tubes?" The foreman's face twisted into an expression of disgust. "Said he needed to prove that a vein would obey a man as readily as it obeys the heart. Laughed when he said it, too, a sound that made my skin crawl. I've been working glass for 30 years, and I can usually tell an honest customer from a questionable one. This fellow." He shook his head. "Well, as I told my lads afterward, those who tamper with the Lord's plumbing usually end up drowning in their own cleverness." Holmes slipped the man a half-crown, and we took our leave, emerging into the fog-shrouded lane where the sound of our footsteps was muffled by the thick air. Holmes stood with his back against the sooty brick wall, his hands deep in his pockets, and his keen eyes focused on some distant point that only he could see. "Articulated gloves of steel and leather," he murmured, as if tasting the words. "A military bearing. Foreign gold. A scar that marks him as a veteran of some violent encounter. Our mysterious Mister. Reed begins to take shape, Watson, like a photograph developing in the chemical bath. You believe him to be some sort of agent?" "An agent, certainly. But of whom, and to what end?" Holmes pushed himself away from the wall and began walking toward the main thoroughfare. "The stolen pumping devices hold the key to that mystery. The glass tubes are merely conduits, passive instruments. It is the motive power that interests me most keenly." He patted the small bottle in his waistcoat pocket. "This will help us determine what substances these tubes were designed to carry. But first, we must return to Baker Street. I have an advertisement to compose for tomorrow's papers." "Advertisement?" Holmes's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Nothing is quite so irresistible to a collector of secrets, my dear Watson, as the opportunity to purchase back his own stolen goods, particularly when he believes he holds all the advantages." That evening, hunched over his writing desk, while the fog pressed against our windows like a living thing seeking entry, Holmes composed a brief notice for the personal columns of several morning papers. To the party who recently supplied capillary glass to the late Dr. F, prototype pumping device and experimental journal recovered from police custody. Terms for immediate private purchase may be discussed. Discretion assured. Address inquiries to AH 221B Baker Street. He showed me the draft, and I shook my head in disapproval. You're dangling yourself as bait, Holmes, if this man killed once to protect his secret. Then he will certainly kill again to recover it, Holmes finished cheerfully. Which is precisely what I am counting upon. Our mysterious friend has demonstrated considerable skill at making murder appear to be suicide. Let us see how he fares when the tables are turned and he finds himself the hunted rather than the hunter. Chapter 4. The spider's web. The hours crept by with the peculiar slowness that attends moments of anticipated danger. Holmes spent the day in restless preparation, checking and rechecking the arrangements he had made with Inspector Lestrade, testing the various methods of illumination we might require, and ensuring that every potential avenue of escape from our sitting room had been quietly sealed. Mrs. Hudson was dispatched to spend the evening with her sister in Camberwell, carrying with her firm instructions to remain there until summoned back. As darkness fell over London, bringing with it a fog so dense it seemed almost solid, Holmes extinguished all but one of our lamps and drew me into the deeper shadows beside the door. The single remaining light cast a warm pool of illumination over his desk, where the morning papers lay scattered about, our fabricated advertisement circled in red ink. "You are armed, Watson?" I touched the familiar weight of my service revolver in my coat pocket. "As always." "Excellent." Our visitor will hardly announce himself with a knock at the door. He is of the breed that prefers to let itself in through whatever entrance presents the fewest complications. Holmes checked his own weapon, a small but efficient pistol that gleamed dully in the lamplight. When he comes, he will be cautious but confident. Men of his type rarely expect to encounter resistance in what they perceive as their own element. We had not long to wait. The first indication of our visitor's presence was the softest possible scraping at the lock, so faint that it might have been mistaken for the settling of old wood in the fog-thickened air. Then came the whisper of footsteps in the hallway, moving with the deliberate care of one who knows his business. A shadow darker than the surrounding darkness appeared in our doorway, pausing there for a moment, as if testing the air for danger. Even in that dim light, certain details were unmistakable. The tall, military bearing that the glassworks foreman had described, the peculiar stiffness of movement that spoke of old wounds imperfectly healed, and most distinctive of all, the unnatural shape of the hands, too broad, too angular, gleaming faintly with the dull shine of metal joints and leather fastenings. The intruder had taken perhaps 2 steps into our sitting room when Holmes's hand fell upon his shoulder like the strike of a cobra, while my own revolver covered him from the shadows. "Pray remain perfectly still, mister." "Read," Holmes said in his driest tone, "or we shall discover whether those remarkable gloves of yours are proof against lead bullets." The man's start of surprise was violent, but brief. The reaction of a professional who recovers quickly from unexpected setbacks. When he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable accent the foreman had noted, though his English was precise and cultured. "Gentlemen, I fear there has been some mistake." "Indeed there has," Holmes replied pleasantly. "The mistake was yours in believing you could murder a man in his own surgery and depart without leaving sufficient traces for a competent investigator to follow. Watson, if you would be so kind as to provide us with better illumination." I struck a match and lit the remaining lamps, flooding the room with golden light that revealed our captive in all his sinister detail. The scar across his brow was even more pronounced than Mrs. Finch had described, a white gully that drew the left eyebrow into a permanent expression of malevolent amusement. His coat was indeed of foreign cut, with the high collar and frogged closures that marked it as continental military styling adapted for civilian wear. But it was the gloves that commanded attention. They were marvels of mechanical ingenuity, articulated constructions of leather and steel that encased his hands from fingertips to mid-forearm. The leather was stained and cracked with use, while metal plates along the palms and knuckles had been polished bright by constant friction. As I watched, the fingers moved with the clicking precision of clockwork, and I realized with a mixture of fascination and revulsion that these were not mere gloves, but sophisticated prosthetics, artificial hands designed to replace those destroyed by some violent mishap. "You came seeking a journal and a pumping device," Holmes observed, settling into his chair with the air of a man beginning an interesting conversation. "The former you obtained 3 nights ago through the simple expedient of murder. The latter was promised to you in this morning's advertisement. Will you tell us for whom you are working?" The man's lips twisted in what might have been intended as a smile. "I am a purchaser of scientific instruments, nothing more." "And a destroyer of scientific lives," Holmes added gently. "Why did Dr. Finch require killing?" "He met with an unfortunate accident while experimenting with his apparatus," the intruder replied, his mechanical fingers flexing with soft clicks. "Such things happen to those who meddle with forces beyond their understanding." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then reached for the small brown bottle he had purchased that morning. With infinite care, he allowed a single drop of its contents to fall upon the inside surface of one of the broken glass tubes. The effect was immediate and startling. The drop spread in a shimmering film of opalescent color that raced along the inner walls like quicksilver. "Most instructive," Holmes murmured, studying the result through his magnifying glass. The interior of these tubes was treated with glycerin to prevent blood coagulation, a sensible precaution for any medical application. But there are also traces of an alkaloid compound, not sufficient to prove immediately fatal, but enough to indicate what had recently flowed through these channels. "Watson?" I bent to examine the tube, and immediately caught the acrid scent I had noticed before, now intensified by the chemical reaction. "That odor. It reminds me of certain South American plant extracts we encountered during my military service. Substances that the natives called devil's milk, highly caustic compounds that raise blisters on exposed skin and if introduced into the bloodstream." I straightened, feeling slightly sick. "Good God, Holmes, the effects would be indescribable." "Precisely so," Holmes agreed. "Now then, my friend, shall we cease this elaborate fencing match? Your name is not Reed. That much is obvious. You were cashiered from whatever military force originally employed you, most likely for conducting experiments that civilized armies consider beyond the pale. You have recently attached yourself to a certain foreign embassy whose interests extend beyond the merely diplomatic. You procure instruments of questionable purpose and test mechanisms of doubtful morality. You approached Dr. Finch because his genius had produced something you lacked the wit to invent yourself. When he refused to cooperate with your purposes, you eliminated him and made his death appear to be the result of his own carelessness. Do you deny it? Our captive's composure cracked like a dam giving way to floodwaters. With a snarl of rage, he twisted in Holmes's grip, struck at the nearest lamp with his steel-clad fist, and plunged us into partial darkness. But I had not served as Watson's companion for so many years without learning to anticipate such moments. Before the man could turn toward the door, I had him by the collar and bore him backward over the hearthrug. He fought with the desperate strength of a trapped animal, his mechanical hands scraping against my wrists and drawing blood. But the struggle was brief. Holmes had the remaining lamp relit within moments, and at the prearranged signal, the crash of our fighting bodies, Inspector Lestrade burst through the door with 2 constables at his heels. Within another minute, our midnight visitor was handcuffed and glaring about him with the baleful eyes of a cornered wolf. "Name," Lestrade demanded, producing his notebook with professional efficiency. The man spat something in what sounded like German, then switched to English. "Radoslav Verhecken, formerly captain in the—" He stopped himself, apparently remembering that discretion might still serve his interests. "Charge?" Lestrade inquired of Holmes. "For the present, breaking and entering with intent to commit theft," Holmes replied calmly. "Tomorrow, with your invaluable assistance, Inspector, we shall add the murder of Dr. Erasmus Finch and such charges of conspiracy as the Foreign Office may deem appropriate to file." Verhecken bared his teeth in a grimace of frustrated rage. "You will prove nothing, English detective." Nothing at all. Holmes stooped and retrieved from where it had fallen within the man's coat a small device of brass and india rubber, no larger than a child's toy. Its nozzle bore dark stains, and along its side was etched a graduated scale marked with minute divisions. "On the contrary," he said softly, holding the object up to catch the lamplight, "I believe we have the complete mechanism now, the artery, the heart, and the hand. The body of evidence will supply whatever else the Crown may require." Chapter 5. The final deduction. Dawn was breaking grey and cheerless over London when we made our way to Scotland Yard, the fog finally beginning to lift after its long siege of the city. Holmes moved with that controlled energy which always possessed him when a case approached its resolution, his sharp features animated by the satisfaction of puzzles solved and justice approaching its inevitable conclusion. We found Inspector Lestrade in conference with the police surgeon, Dr. Stamford, whose reputation for thoroughness had earned him Holmes's grudging respect. At my friend's insistence, Lestrade had ordered a second and more detailed examination of Dr. Finch's remains, and it was clear from both men's expressions that this investigation had yielded significant results. "You were quite right to request another look, Mr. Holmes," Dr. Stamford began without preamble. "The wound to the victim's wrist shows clear evidence of trauma inflicted from without, not within. Under magnification, I can see minute glass fragments driven inward through the flesh, a pattern entirely inconsistent with a self-inflicted injury." Holmes nodded with satisfaction. "And the condition of the blood vessels themselves?" "Most revealing. There is pronounced inflammation along the major vein, extending nearly 2 inches from the primary wound site. The tissue shows clear signs of chemical irritation, and I have found crystalline deposits consistent with certain plant alkaloids known to be highly caustic to living tissue. The doctor's professional demeanor could not entirely conceal his disgust. Whoever did this was not content merely to kill. He sought to inflict the maximum possible suffering in the process. "The method becomes clear," Holmes observed, settling into a chair with the air of a lecturer preparing to address his students. "Our friend Verhecken and his mysterious employer required a means of introducing a toxic substance directly into the human circulatory system, a delivery method that would be both swift and certain. Dr. Finch's revolutionary capillary tubes provided the perfect solution. The glass could be sealed with the poison inside, inserted into a blood vessel through a small puncture, then broken with a sharp tap, releasing the contents while the shattered fragments ensured the wound would continue bleeding." Lestrade frowned. "But why go to such elaborate lengths? A knife or pistol would have been simpler." "Ah, but neither would have appeared to be an accident," Holmes replied. "The beauty of this method, from the killer's perspective, lay in its apparent correspondence to Dr. Finch's own experimental work. A surgeon experimenting with glass tubes meets his death through the failure of those same tubes. The coroner would naturally assume that the poor fellow had fallen victim to his own dangerous innovations." Later that morning, in the bare interview room where Verhecken sat, manacled to a heavy chair, we laid out the complete chain of evidence. The capillary tubes, the pumping device, the pathologist's report, the glass worker's testimony identifying the purchaser, Mrs. Finch's statement regarding the mysterious visitor. Each piece fitted into place with the inexorable logic of mathematical proof. Verhecken examined these exhibits in a silence that spoke more eloquently than any confession. When at last he raised his eyes to meet Holmes's steady gaze, something seemed to collapse within him. "Shall we send for your ambassador?" Lestrade suggested, with heavy-handed cunning. A muscle twitched beneath Verhecken's scarred brow. "There is no ambassador involved in this matter." "Then perhaps the military attaché whose correspondence bears the seal of the Imperial Eagle," Holmes suggested mildly. The man's head came up sharply, then fell again as he realized how completely he had betrayed himself. When he spoke, it was in the flat tone of one who sees no advantage in continued deception. "You English speak much of law and justice," he said. "In war, there is only utility. The doctor could create vessels to carry blood through the human body. What matter whether they carried blood or other substances? He possessed knowledge that my government required. He refused to sell that knowledge. Therefore—" He shrugged his mechanical shoulders with a gesture that made the chains clink softly. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "I confess, Verhecken, that there are times when I am tempted to wish our civilization had remained a pace or two behind its present development. We perfect the art of healing. Admirable. We create mechanical hands to restore function to the maimed. Laudable. And then we discover that the same knowledge which mends can also destroy, that the instruments of mercy may become the tools of murder." He rose and moved to the narrow window, gazing out at the grey London morning where ordinary people went about their ordinary business, unconscious of the darker currents that flowed beneath the surface of civilized society. "You speak of war as if it justified any means," Holmes continued, but war itself is merely organized murder dressed in the uniform of necessity. The true tragedy is not that you killed Dr. Finch, though that was certainly tragic enough, but that you corrupted his vision. He sought to preserve life. You perverted his work to destroy it. By noon, the Foreign Office had made one of those discreet interventions which are understood in Whitehall without being recorded in any official documents. Verhecken was quietly transferred from Lestrade's custody to other, more shadowy authorities. A certain letter, marked private and confidential, arrived at Baker Street that evening, bearing the unmistakable hand of a gentleman whose signature I had learned to recognize during my association with Holmes. The missive thanked my friend with warm appreciation while cautioning him with diplomatic delicacy. There would be no public trial. A certain treaty was even then being negotiated, and a scandal involving foreign agents might prove embarrassing to all parties concerned. Dr. Finch would be officially mourned as a pioneer whose revolutionary work had led to a tragic accident, a necessary falsehood to preserve larger truths about international relations. Holmes read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it beneath the brass match-stand on the mantelpiece. And thus ends another excellent opportunity for public education, he observed with dry resignation. The Crown's subjects will sleep safely in their beds, blissfully ignorant of how narrowly they escaped a rather unpleasant innovation in the art of murder. He lit his pipe with deliberate care and settled into his chair, his grey eyes fixed upon the dancing flames in the grate. The fog had finally lifted completely, and through our windows I could see the first stars appearing in a clear November sky. After a long silence, he spoke again, though I sensed his words were directed not only to me, but to that invisible audience of past cases and future mysteries that seemed always to populate his thoughts. Consider the pattern, Watson. A man of genius conceives a method to preserve life, to carry the vital essence where nature has failed to provide adequate channels. It is a noble aspiration, worthy of the highest traditions of medical science. Then enters another man, no better nor worse than 100 others I have encountered, who perceives in that life-saving innovation nothing but a more efficient means of dealing death. Between the two stands only the thinnest membrane of moral choice. You credit Verhecken with too much complexity, I protested. He was a simple brute, motivated by nothing more elevated than professional advancement and personal gain. Perhaps, Holmes conceded, and yet I cannot escape the feeling that he was as much victim as perpetrator, a tool shaped by forces larger than his individual malice. Dr. Finch's vanity played its part as well. His hunger for recognition, his determination to be remembered as the man who conquered death itself, made him vulnerable to approaches he might otherwise have rejected. He reached for the fire tongs and lifted one of the remaining glass tubes from where it lay, drying on the hearth. In the firelight, it appeared almost alive, pulsing with inner radiance like a captured flame. The ancient Greeks spoke of hubris, he murmured, the fatal pride that leads mortals to challenge the gods. Perhaps every great discovery carries within it the seeds of its own corruption. We learn to heal, and then we learn to poison. We master the forces of nature, and then we turn them against our fellow men. With the gentlest possible pressure, he touched the tube's edge with the tongs. It snapped cleanly, its fragments chiming like distant bells as they fell into the ash. There, he said with finality, Dr. Finch's artery of immortality proves as fragile as the flesh it was meant to serve. Perhaps that is the true moral of this affair, that nothing we create, however brilliant or beneficial, can long survive the tendency of human nature to corrupt even its noblest impulses. He tossed the broken remains into the fire, where they flared briefly and were consumed. Outside our window, a church bell tolled the hour, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the clip-clop of a late hansom making its way through the London streets. The familiar sounds of the city settling into evening routine provided a comforting counterpoint to the darker themes that had occupied our attention. "And yet," I ventured, seeking to lighten the mood, "justice has been served. Mrs. Finch will sleep more peacefully knowing the truth about her husband's death. That must count for something." Holmes's expression softened slightly. "Indeed it must, Watson. Indeed it must. It is not given to us to solve all the world's problems or to prevent every corruption of human genius. We can only address the particular evils that come within our reach and trust that others will tend to those beyond our sphere." He set aside his pipe and moved to the corner where his violin case rested against the wall. As was his custom when a case had both satisfied and troubled him in equal measure, he took out the instrument and drew across its strings a melody so low and melancholy that it seemed to give voice to all the sadness inherent in the human condition. The music that filled our sitting room that night was unlike his usual improvisations, less technically brilliant, perhaps, but more deeply felt. It spoke of lives cut short and dreams corrupted, of the thin line that separates healing from harming, of the eternal struggle between humanity's higher angels and its baser impulses. As I listened, I found myself thinking of Dr. Finch's widow, sitting alone in her house in Wimpole Street, and of the strange circumstances that had brought us into contact with her grief. The last notes died away into silence, leaving only the soft whisper of settling coals in the grate. Holmes returned the violin to its case with the reverent care he always showed for things of beauty, then stood for a moment at the window, looking out at the gas-lit streets, where the drama of London's millions continued to unfold in countless, unseen variations. "Come, Watson," he said at last, turning back to the warmth of our familiar sitting room. "Tomorrow will bring new problems, new mysteries, new opportunities to pit our wits against the darker aspects of human nature. Tonight, let us be content with having served justice as best we could, and leave the larger questions to philosophers better equipped than ourselves to grapple with such weighty matters." And with that characteristic mixture of satisfaction and humility that marked the conclusion of all his cases, Sherlock Holmes settled back into his chair, reached for his well-worn copy of Winwood Reade's The Martyrdom of Man, and allowed the evening to claim its due portion of peace after a day devoted to the pursuit of truth through London's fog-shrouded streets. Thus concluded the singular affair which I have set down as the adventure of the glass artery, a case that demonstrated once again my friend's remarkable ability to perceive truth where others saw only confusion, and to serve justice even when that service must remain forever hidden from the public eye. If these pages serve to illustrate anything beyond the particular facts they record, it is perhaps that the greatest crimes are often those that corrupt noble purposes to base ends, and that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against the human tendency to transform instruments of healing into weapons of destruction. And so concludes The Adventure of the glass artery. Another strange case unravelled by the sharp mind of Sherlock Holmes and faithfully recorded by Dr. Watson. What did you think of this mystery? Were you able to solve it before Holmes revealed the truth? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. I always enjoy reading them. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel for more adventures of the great detective. You can also join our membership for ad-free, exclusive mysteries. The link is in the description. Until next time, keep your wits sharp, your curiosity alive, and remember, wherever the fog of London gathers, a mystery is never far behind. This is Detective Street signing off.